So last week we were asking the question that's on the screen, what happened to David? And we were asking that legitimately because David, as you well know, was a man chosen by God, chosen to be king, chosen because he had an unusually special heart. It's called a heart according to God's own heart, a heart after God's own heart. And we saw David over and over again being this man of character and this man of honor, and he had this most unusual faith. Even as a boy, he would walk out and face a giant named Goliath because of his trust, his absolute trust in God. And yet we got to 1 Samuel chapter 21, and we saw something different in David. Something, as we've been saying, out of character. Because he's telling lies. And he's acting like a madman. And he's afraid. As a result of his lies, you know by now that every living creature in the city of Nob was put to death by the deranged king named Saul. And so we begin to ask, how can a man of such stellar character become someone who does this? The truth of the matter is, it can happen to any of us and does happen to us. And so we showed this principle that I personally have been using for 25 years at least, derived from this story in the life of David and derived from the life of Elijah. And what we saw was that there are three basic energy reservoirs in our lives. And one is spiritual, and one is emotional, and one is physical. And when we begin to be depleted in any one or more of those reservoirs, we are subject to discouragement and to fear and to despair. And so physically we know, quickly we remember that it's not enough sleep, and it's too much work, and it's a poor diet, and it's not enough exercise, and it's just going too fast for too long. And spiritually, we said primarily it means you lose your connection with God. You can come to church and be here every time the doors open, as we say. You can know the facts and the figures, but that does not guarantee you will have a connection with God whereby you really put your confidence and your trust in Him on a daily routine basis. Emotionally, we get so easily drained because of fear. There's fear all over our nation right now. We become emotionally drained because of loss. We lose a job. We lose a spouse. We lose a child. We become emotionally drained because of relationship problems. Chronic relationship problems with a child. Chronic relationship problems with a spouse, with a place of employment, a boss, a coworker. We become emotionally drained because of finances sometimes. Anytime there's an issue which we cannot find resolution with, it works on us emotionally. Now, David, we believe, was physically drained. He's off in search for just some basic food from Ahimelech the priest in the city of Nob. He is afraid, which is the first time we've ever read about David being afraid. David has had to run from his home. He can't go back and see his wife. He's even having to leave the land of his father and the land of his forefathers and the land of his God and go into these foreign lands. He's so uncertain about the future. And in the midst of all that, it seems momentarily, as it does for many of us momentarily, thankfully momentarily, he loses his ability to truly put his trust in God. And so he becomes fatigued. And when you get fatigued, it leads to an unclear thinking pattern, a fog, and you want to escape, and you want to run, and you want to quit. And it causes you to do things that you would normally never do. Now, I hope you can remember that principle, but I'm going to emphasize it as quickly as I possibly can from the life of Elijah. Elijah is the one I call in the Old Testament the Superman of the Old Testament. But at the same time, the New Testament makes this statement, Elijah was a man just like us. Now, I hope you'll remember that. He's a man just like us. Because if what happened to Elijah can happen to Elijah, it can certainly happen to Ken, and it has happened to Ken. Now, I won't be able to give the remedy that God gives to David and gives to Elijah until next week. But I want you to see it play out in the life of Elijah as I talk as fast as I possibly can. So you've got to stay awake. My dad said he didn't sleep any last night, so I figured he's going to sleep during the service, but he's still awake right now, I can tell. So Elijah is the prophet for God. He's the worker for God when Ahab is the king. Now, everyone remember Ahab? He is really, really bad. And he takes a wife who is from Sidonia, a Sidonian princess. You remember her name, don't you? Her name is Jezebel. And she's even worse than Ahab. She's wicked to the core. Now, when someone really bad marries someone like Jezebel, matters even get worse. They're tyrants. Everything is horrible. And so God gives a command to Elijah as you begin in 1 Kings chapter 17. This whole story just works through chapter 17, 18, and 19 of the book of 1 Kings. And that's about all you have in all the Bible. A little bit more. But that's about all you have of this, what I call Superman of the Old Testament. Elijah, you go up to Ahab and you tell him it's not going to rain. There's not even going to be dew on the land until I give the word. Now, can you imagine how Ahab is going to react? And God must know the wrath of Ahab, because immediately God says to Elijah, I want you to go over to the distant Kerith ravine, and from the Kerith ravine there will be a little brook there, and you can take your water, and I'll send the birds to bring you your food. Now, I need to ask you, would you do a deal like that? I've seen, on occasion, the kind of food that birds carry around. And I don't think that sounds too good. Would you do a deal like that? And yet Elijah is this man of such faith and such confidence in God. He goes straight to the Kerith ravine. There, he can get his water. The birds will come. They'll bring his bread. They'll bring his food. And that goes on for a while until Elijah notices that the brook is drying up. It's a sign that there is a drought all over the land, just like God said through Elijah. There won't be any rain. There won't be any dew. Finally, that little brook disappears. And God says, okay, I want you to go to Zarephath. In the region of Sidon, there is a widow there. She has children. There's a widow there. And you can stay there and your food will be supplied. But Zarephath? In the region of Sidon? Would you do a deal like that? Did you just catch I just said that Jezebel was a what? A Sidonian princess. Her father is king in Sidon. That's the center of Baal worship. Would you want to go hide there? And yet Elijah is this man of faith. He believes God to the point that he'll do whatever God says to do. That's called faith. He goes to Zarephath. He stays there for a while. He has plenty to eat. We don't know how much time passes, but it's somewhere around the 3-year mark, maybe a little longer now. There's not been a drop of rain on all of Israel. Now, can you imagine what that would look like? I mean, 3 weeks ago here in this country, all the pastures that were supposed to be green were brown because of no rain for a little while. What if it were 3 years? 3 years. In fact, it is so bad that if you look across the hillsides, they are dotted with the carcasses of dead animals. And Ahab is furious. Ahab has been sending out people everywhere to try to find Elijah because he thinks it's Elijah's fault. And his order is to kill Elijah. And you know what God says to Elijah at this moment? You go back to Ahab and you confront him. And you basically tell him this is all his fault. Now, would you do a deal like that? I mean, this guy's looking for you everywhere trying to kill you. And yet Elijah is the Superman of the Old Testament. And he marches right up to Ahab. Happens to be at a location called Mount Carmel. And he marches up to Ahab. What a guy. Somehow Jezebel is not there when he encounters Ahab. And he and Ahab begin to have a conversation. And Ahab agrees to a contest. For the question has been asked, as all the people have assembled. And Elijah said, assemble all your people. And the people came to this mountain. And Elijah asked the question, who is God? And the people are so silent because they don't know any longer who God is, which is what's happening in our country right now. And it's very disgusting to me, if I can say that. It's very disgusting that so many people are being led away from the God who created us all and created everything that we enjoy. But that's what happened even back then. Who is God? And they sat silent because they didn't know who God was. And in effect, Elijah says, would you like to find out? Would you like to find out if Baal's God or if the God of heaven is God? And they say, oh yes. Isn't that interesting? See, I think deep down, everybody, even in our troubled country right now, everybody really wants to know who God is. They just don't know how to find it. So you remember the famous story? The famous story, Elijah says, okay, let's each build an altar. I'll build one. Prophets of Baal will build one. And we'll call upon our respective God for fire. And the God that answered with the fire, He's the real God. And the people say, yes, this is a good thing. So the prophets of Baal go first. And they build their altar and they put their bull calf on it and they begin to call out to Baal, but Baal doesn't answer. And you remember what Elijah does? He will taunt them. You can almost see him bending over and looking at them and say, fellas, yell louder. Try harder. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's gone on a journey. You got to work harder at this. And this goes on apparently for hours. And finally, they just throw up their hands and say, it's not going to work today. So now it's Elijah's turn. He builds the altar out of stone, puts wood on it, gets the bull calf on it. Gets a little dramatic. He has a trench dug around that altar, and they go get water. Where they got water, I'm not sure, but apparently down the mountain a ways there's a sea. And they haul water up and put it in the trench. They pour water all over the bull calf till the trench is full. And now Elijah speaks, not to the people, but to our God. He says, God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, let these people know today who is God. And all of a sudden, there is a fire that bolts from heaven that consumes the bull calf and the wood, and it even vaporizes the stone. And that's got to get, it should get our attention, because that's some kind of fire like they have never seen before, and like you and I have not seen. I mean, we got a new fireman back here, or at least new to us, but he's not seen a fire that hot, I know, because you build a fire in your fireplace, or at least Greg does, I know, and he gets it really hot, but when it goes out, the stone are still there. Because that fire has to get to about 4,300 and something degrees Fahrenheit before granite can be vaporized. That's what God does that day. And all the people know immediately that there is one God, and that's the God of heaven. You know what Elijah does now? He orders the killing of 450 prophets of Baal. He's involved in the killing of 450 prophets of Baal. Can you imagine, even if they are enemies, going through that? You know what he does now? He climbs up the top of a mountain. Anybody ever climbed to the top of a mountain? Greg and I have. That's when I saved his life from the bear. He'll have to tell you that story sometime. But I'm telling you, climbing to the top of a mountain is not easy. It's very, very tiresome. He gets to the top of the mountain and he begins to beg God, will you now let it rain? And it doesn't, there's no answer. He'll tell his servant, go out there and tell me what you see. And the servant will come back and say, I don't see anything. He'll beg God longer. Tells that servant, go tell me. One time the servant came back and said, well, all that's out there is a little cloud about the size of a man's fist. Elijah says, all right, it's going to rain. And he goes down and finds Ahab and he says, Ahab, you better get going. You better get in that chariot and get going. It's going to rain. And Ahab goes back to Jezreel. And it says that Elijah girds up his garment and begins to run toward Jezreel. And he runs and beats Ahab. I don't know how far that is, but I heard one time it was 26 miles that he ran. And the day is over. Now you tell me where Elijah is spiritually at the end of this day. And I will tell you that's probably where we get from somewhere a long time ago that phrase, a mountaintop experience. He had a mountaintop encounter with God. Spiritually, he's really strong. But where is he physically? Where is he physically? I mean, it's been a long day. It's been a long day of dealing with all this and building an altar and killing a bull calf and getting the water up there. And then to top it off, he climbs a mountain and he runs to Jezreel, 26 miles. I mean, I think physically he's pretty drained, don't you? And where is he emotionally? Where is he emotionally? Can you imagine the emotional drain of spending a few hours taunting the prophets of Baal and looking at them and saying, come on, guys, work harder, yell louder. And can you imagine where he is emotionally after he is involved in killing 450 people? Putting 450 people to the sword? And can you imagine where he is emotionally when he climbs a mountain and begs and begs and begs and finally sees the result? Remember last week when I said, how do you feel when you get through with a big, big event? Maybe you've been planning for that big event for weeks, months, and now the day is here. And you go through all the things of that day. At the end of the day, when it's all over, remember how that feels? You're numb emotionally. You're numb physically. I remember one time giving a talk in San Antonio. During one of the breaks, I talked to a neurosurgeon. We sit down beside each other. I said, so you operate on what parts of the neural system? So I do a lot of brain work. I said, what does a typical surgery on the brain look like? And he said, it looks like about 9 hours. A very tedious, difficult work. And I said, that's interesting to me. I said, can you tell me what it's like when you come home in the evening after you completed a 9-hour surgery on someone's brain? And he said, I am so numb, I can barely get into the house and find my chair. I can't even sometimes find the light switch, and I just plop down on my chair and can't move. Physically and emotionally what? Drained. Elijah's there. So as you begin chapter 19, Jezebel's back on the scene. And Jezebel sends a message to Elijah. And she says in her message, by this time tomorrow, you will be like one of my prophets. Now, our prophets are what? They're dead. By this time tomorrow, you are a dead man. Well, that's no big thing for someone who I call the Superman of the Old Testament, is it? That's no big thing. But for some reason, it just becomes a big thing. It says Elijah is afraid, and Elijah runs. Now, does that sound like the Elijah I've been talking about? Does that sound out of character for Elijah? What in the world has happened that this great man of unusual faith and strength is on the run? And he gets out under a juniper tree, it says, and he's talking to God, and he says, here's a famous line, I've had enough. Now, do you capture what he just said? I've had enough. Some of you are as old as I, and so you can remember the old Popeye cartoons. Remember the old Popeye cartoons? I used to watch all the old Popeye cartoons. And Popeye would always take a beating. Every cartoon, he took a massive beating. And it was right to the point that he couldn't take it any longer. And he would often say, I've had all I can stand, and I can't stand no more. And that's where the can of spinach would appear. And suddenly the arms would get big, and the strength would return, and away he would go. That's exactly what Elijah is saying. I've had all I can stand, and I can't stand no more. Now, I know you have been there. And I know I have been there. And I know it happens to people all the time. When they get drained physically and or emotionally and or spiritually, and something happens and they can't take any more, and Elijah says, I have had enough. And watch the next statement. Take my life. Let me die. I'm no better than my ancestors. There have been other prophets who've come and tried to work with people like Ahab. They couldn't do it. I'm not any more successful. I'm not any better. Let me die. Can you imagine? Getting in the fog so deeply and getting so discouraged that you want to completely give up. I can't stand anymore. Now, if you're really honest, you have been there. That happens to people all the time. Good, honest people who trust God, people who belong to God, and life piles up and piles up and piles up until they reach that particular point. And so Elijah is fatigued, and he's in a fog. And he flirts with something he would normally never flirt with, even death itself. And that happens, my friends, to really good people who just get so emptied. Now, I don't have time this morning to show you the remedy, but in both the life of David and in the life of Elijah, God does things very special that are going to teach us what we do when we find ourselves in that situation. Well, it's better if we keep ourselves out of that somehow. I think by understanding the principle, you can hedge this a bit and not get so deeply involved. But next week, we see what God does to pick people back up.